David sat in the corner of the large dining room, his wheelchair blending into the shadows as his family laughed and joked without him. The clatter of plates and the hum of conversation filled the room, but David might as well have been invisible. His son, Mark, stood at the head of the table, his voice booming as he recounted a story from work. His daughter, Emily, nodded along, barely glancing in David's direction. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time when David was the center of attention at every family gathering, a time when his opinion mattered, when his voice was the loudest in the room. But that was before the accident, before the wheelchair. Now, he was just a shadow in his own home, forgotten by the very people he had spent his life raising and supporting. As David watched his family, a bitter thought crossed his mind. They don't even realize I'm here. The laughter echoed louder, and David's heart clenched. He wheeled himself toward the window, away from the noise. As he stared out at the sprawling garden, memories of his life before the wheelchair came flooding back. Memories of a time when he was respected, when he was someone his family relied on. But those days were long gone, and his family, it seemed, had moved on without him. David's hand clenched the armrest of his wheelchair. Maybe they had forgotten him, but they would soon remember. As the night of the reunion wore on, David's family remained oblivious to his growing sense of isolation. His eldest son, Mark, was deep in conversation with their cousin, Richard, boasting about his latest business ventures. On the surface, Mark appeared successful, his expensive suit, the sleek car he had parked outside, but beneath the facade, his life was falling apart. His marriage to Catherine had become strained, and the pressure of his high-stakes job was slowly eroding his confidence. Still, he didn't look to his father for guidance. Why would he? David had been silent for so long, his voice of reason long forgotten by his own children. Meanwhile, Emily sat in a corner, glued to her phone, frantically answering work emails. She had risen quickly in her career, but the cost was steep. She was anxious, stressed, and constantly fearing that she'd be replaced if she didn't keep up with the demanding pace. She felt the weight of her job pressing on her shoulders, but asking for help, especially from her father, seemed impossible. Emily had always prided herself on her independence, but in truth, she missed the days when her dad's advice could set everything right. Tom, David's youngest son, was the quietest of the bunch. He had always struggled to find his way, bouncing from one job to another, never able to get a handle on his finances. Debt was piling up, and Tom had begun receiving calls from collectors. He was drowning, but asking his father for help felt like admitting failure. In his mind, David had already checked out of their lives, so why would he come to his aid now? David, watching from the window, could see their struggles as clearly as if they were written on their faces. But none of them had the slightest inkling that he knew. He had tried, in the past, to offer help, to be a guide as he once was, but his children had grown distant over the years. His advice had become background noise, something they politely nodded at but never followed. Still, they didn't know the whole story. They didn't know that David had quietly amassed a fortune, one he had never told them about. It wasn't just wealth, it was a life-changing sum, enough to turn all of their troubles around. But money wasn't what they needed, not really. What they needed was to remember what truly mattered: family, respect, and the strength they had always drawn from each other. And David, though weakened physically, was determined to remind them of that. As the night ended and his children left without so much as a word to him, David wheeled himself back to his room. The mysterious letter sat on his nightstand, unopened. It had arrived a few days earlier from a lawyer he didn't recognize, promising to bring closure to something from David's past. With a deep breath, David opened the letter, his hands trembling slightly. As his eyes scanned the contents, his heart raced. The lawyer had discovered something, a part of David's life that he had buried long ago, a decision that would force him to confront his past in a way he had never expected. The letter's final sentence echoed in David's mind. "Your family must know the truth." But what truth? What secret had David been keeping for so long, and how could revealing it change everything for his family? David closed the letter, his mind swirling with possibilities. Whatever it was time. Time for his family to see him not as the man they thought they knew, but as the man he truly was. As David contemplates the letter, he decides to set a plan in motion that will change his family's perception of him forever. What does the letter reveal? What secret is David hiding from his family that could alter the course of their lives? The days following the family reunion were tense for David. The weight of the unopened letter pressed heavily on his conscience, and he found himself wrestling with the past. He had always been a man of few words, someone who believed in action over idle talk. His life had been one of responsibility and hard work, but there was more to his story than his family knew. David sat at his desk, the letter open before him once again. The lawyer's words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront a part of his past he had buried. Years ago, during his career as a businessman, David had made a series of investments, wise investments that had grown exponentially over time. But rather than flaunting his wealth, he had chosen to keep it a secret, even from his family. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. David had wanted his children to earn their success on their own, just as he had. He didn't want them to rely on his fortune or become complacent. But now, as he sat alone in his wheelchair, forgotten by the very people he had worked so hard to provide for, David wondered if he had made the right choice. The investments had grown into a staggering fortune, one that could change his children's lives forever. But revealing it wasn't just about the money. It was about teaching them a lesson they had failed to learn: respect, humility, and the value of family. David picked up the phone and dialed the lawyer's number. "It's time," he said, his voice steady. "Let's put the plan in motion." The story shifts to a flashback of David's youth. He wasn't always confined to a wheelchair. In his younger days, he was a strong, determined man who worked tirelessly to build a successful business from the ground up. He made connections, negotiated deals, and navigated the challenges of the business world with precision. During this time, David had made a series of secret investments in companies that were just starting out. While some of them failed, others flourished, growing into massive enterprises that yielded enormous returns. But David, a man of humility, chose to keep this fortune a secret from his family. His reasoning was simple. He didn't want his children to become entitled or dependent on his wealth. He wanted them to build their own lives, to earn their own success. He wanted them to understand the value of hard work. But as the years passed, David began to see the consequences of his decision. His children had grown distant, and as his health declined, so did their respect for him. David's lawyer, Mr. Harris, arrived at his home a few days later, carrying with him a briefcase filled with documents. They sat together in David's study, going over the details of the plan. "You're sure this is what you want to do?" Mr. Harris asked, looking over his glasses at David. David nodded. "They need to understand. This isn't just about the money. It's about teaching them what really matters." Mr. Harris smiled. "You're a wise man, David. I'll make sure everything is ready for the reunion." As David finalizes his plans with Mr. Harris, he knows that his family is about to experience a revelation that will not only shock them, but force them to confront their own actions. What will David reveal at the reunion, and how will it change his children's lives? With the reunion looming, David's heart raced. His children, oblivious to the events that were about to unfold, continued their lives as usual. Each sibling was preoccupied with their personal crises: Mark with his disintegrating marriage, Emily with her career woes, and Tom buried in his mounting debts. None of them had the faintest idea that their father was about to reveal something that would force them to reconsider their choices and their treatment of him. David sat in his study, reflecting on how everything had led up to this point. He had made countless sacrifices for his family, and yet here he was, ignored, invisible in his own home. But now, they would have to listen. They would have to see him for who he truly was, not the frail man they'd grown accustomed to overlooking, but a man of strength, resilience, and wisdom. The lawyer, Mr. Harris, had carefully prepared all the necessary documents. The revelation of David's secret fortune wasn't just about shocking his children. It was about opening their eyes to the consequences of their actions, or, in this case, their inaction. David wanted to teach them a lesson in humility, gratitude, and the importance of family. The family reunion was set to take place at David's home, the same place where so many gatherings had been held before. This time, however, things were different. David's children were tense, each burdened by their personal struggles. Mark was distracted by an argument with his wife. Emily seemed perpetually glued to her phone, and Tom's anxiety was visible in the way he nervously tapped his foot, a sure sign of the financial trouble he was in. They didn't even notice the subtle changes in David's demeanor. The usual quiet resignation had been replaced by a calm, quiet confidence. He knew that the time had come to finally speak his truth. As dinner concluded, the usual pleasantries began to wind down, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. David cleared his throat, drawing the attention of his children. "I have something I need to share with all of you," he began, his voice steady but firm. His children looked up, surprised. It was rare for David to assert himself in such a way. "I know I haven't been a large part of your lives in recent years," he continued, "but that wasn't by choice. You all became distant as I grew older, and somewhere along the way, I became invisible to you." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Emily finally put her phone down, sensing the gravity of the moment. Tom's brow furrowed, his nervous tapping slowing as he focused on his father's words. David took a deep breath before continuing. "But I haven't been as helpless as you think I am. I've made decisions over the years that you know nothing about, decisions that will change your lives. But before we get to that, I need you all to understand something." The room fell into a heavy silence. David's children were hanging on his every word, unsure of where this was going. "You've all faced struggles, that much is clear, but none of you ever thought to ask for my help. You assumed I had nothing left to offer. You turned away from me, and in doing so, you forgot the lessons I tried to teach you when you were young." David paused, letting his words sink in. His children looked at each other, their faces clouded with guilt and confusion. "Now," David said, his voice growing stronger, "it's time for you to learn another lesson, a lesson in humility and a lesson in respect." With that, he motioned to Mr. Harris, who stood up and opened the briefcase he had brought with him. Inside were documents that would reveal the extent of David's fortune, a fortune his children had never known existed. As Mr. Harris began to explain the details of David's investments, the shock on his children's faces was palpable. They had never expected this. But what would David do with this newfound power over them? Would he forgive their neglect, or would he make them earn their place in his life once again? The air in the room was thick with anticipation as Mr. Harris slowly unwrapped the layers of David's carefully hidden life. His children stared at him, their previous detachment and disinterest now replaced with wide-eyed shock. They had grown so accustomed to seeing their father as fragile, insignificant, and outdated, never imagining that he could wield such power over them. "Your father," Mr. Harris began, holding up a stack of neatly organized documents, "is not the man you thought he was. Over the past several decades, David has made a series of investments in several industries: technology, real estate, and even global markets. These investments have grown exponentially, far beyond what anyone would expect." David's children sat frozen, disbelief etched across their faces. Mark leaned forward, as if trying to comprehend what the lawyer was saying, while Emily and Tom exchanged confused glances, wondering if they had somehow missed something all these years. Harris continued, flipping through the papers. "As of now, your father's estate is valued at over $50 million. A collective gasp echoed in the room. Emily's hand flew to her mouth while Tom's eyes widened, and Mark stared in stunned silence. The weight of the revelation hung in the air, crushing their previous perceptions of their father as a man who had nothing left to offer. "50 million, Mark muttered, almost to himself. He couldn't believe it. But David wasn't finished. He cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to him. His eyes were calm, but the intensity of his gaze commanded the room. "This wealth, it's not just money. It's the result of a lifetime of hard work, careful decisions, and sacrifices that none of you bothered to ask about. You assumed I was a shadow of the man I used to be, but that assumption cost you." David's words stung, but there was truth in them. His children had abandoned him emotionally, treating him like a relic from the past. They had forgotten the man who had once guided their every step, choosing instead to focus on their own struggles while dismissing him in his time of need. The room was silent, except for the soft rustle of papers as Mr. Harris placed them back in his briefcase. Emily was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling slightly. "Dad, why didn't you tell us?" David met her gaze, his expression softening. "Because you never asked. You never once looked past what you saw on the surface. You never thought to ask about my life, my experiences, or my wisdom. You saw the wheelchair and thought that was all I had become." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She knew he was right. Mark shifted in his seat, his pride keeping him from speaking at first, but the weight of the situation forced him to confront the truth. We didn't know. We thought you had nothing left." David smiled faintly, though there was a hint of sadness behind it. "That's the problem, Mark. You assumed, and that assumption cost you. But now, you have a choice to change, to see things differently." Tom, who had remained unusually quiet throughout the conversation, finally spoke up. "What do we do now, Dad? Where do we go from here?" David took a deep breath, knowing that this was the turning point for all of them. "That's up to you, Tom. This wealth, this fortune, it isn't just a safety net. It's an opportunity. But it's not going to fix everything. It's going to require work, humility, and most importantly, a reconnection with the values I tried to teach you all those years ago." David's message was clear. The revelation of his hidden fortune wasn't a handout or an easy solution to their problems. It was a chance for them to reflect on their lives, to rebuild their relationship with their father, and to rediscover the core values they had forgotten along the way: respect, humility, and the importance of family. As the children sat reeling from the revelation, Mr. Harris began to explain the details of David's estate plan. "Your father has left specific instructions for how this wealth will be distributed. But first, there's something you all must do. A task, if you will. One that will determine how much of this fortune you'll receive." The room tensed once more. What was David asking of them? And how far were they willing to go to reclaim their place in his life? The room was still, with only the occasional creak of a chair breaking the silence. David's children sat in shock, still grappling with the revelation of their father's hidden fortune. But just as the idea of wealth began to settle into their minds, Mr. Harris cleared his throat, his serious tone slicing through the tension. "Before we proceed with the distribution of the estate, there is one final matter to address," Mr. Harris began, adjusting his glasses. He held up a stack of envelopes, one for each of David's children. "Inside these envelopes is a task. Your father has designed this specifically for each of you, to ensure that this wealth is used wisely and with purpose." David's children exchanged confused glances. A task? What could their father possibly ask of them? They had expected a straightforward inheritance, a sudden, life-altering windfall to fix their mounting problems. But instead, it seemed that their father's wisdom, something they had overlooked for so long, was still guiding their path. Mark, ever the practical businessman, was the first to speak. "What kind of task are we talking about? I mean, we understand now that you have this fortune, but is there really a need for this? David looked at his son, his gaze steady and calm. Yes, Mark, there is. This money isn't a solution to your problems. It's a tool. And like any tool, it's only useful if you know how to wield it. I want you to show me that you can. With that, Mr. Harris handed each child their envelope. Mark, Emily, and Tom took them cautiously, as if the paper itself carried the weight of their father's expectations. One by one, they opened them, reading the tasks written inside. Mark's task. Mark's letter was simple, but it hit him like a punch to the gut. You've always prided yourself on your business acumen, Mark, but you've forgotten what makes a true leader. Empathy. I want you to donate $100,000 to a struggling small business and offer your guidance to help them succeed. Only then will you understand the true value of the wealth you seek to inherit. Mark's face reddened. To give away money and help someone else succeed? The idea was alien to him. His entire career had been about climbing the corporate ladder, looking out for himself and his own success. But now, his father was challenging him to help someone else climb, something that would test not just his business skills, but his character. Emily's task. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded her letter. You've always chased success, Emily, but at what cost? You've distanced yourself from the people who care about you, thinking that your career defines your worth. I want you to take 3 months off from work and spend that time rebuilding your relationships with the people you've pushed away. Only then will you understand that true wealth comes from the connections you build, not the titles you hold. Emily's heart sank. 3 months off? Her career had been everything to her, the one thing she thought she could control. But her father's words rang true. She had neglected her relationships, isolating herself in her quest for success. Could she really step back from her job, even temporarily, to fix the relationships she had ignored? Tom's task. Tom's task was the hardest of all. You've struggled, Tom, but it's because you've never learned the value of hard work and discipline. I want you to pay off your debts, not with my money, but with your own effort. Find a stable job, work hard, and clear your debts within the next year. Only when you've earned your way out of the hole you're in will I release the inheritance to you. Tom's mouth went dry as he read the letter. His father wasn't going to bail him out. Instead, he was expected to pull himself up, something Tom had never truly done. He had always leaned on others, drifting from one job to the next, never taking full responsibility for his life. Now, his father was challenging him to prove his worth, not by inheriting money, but by earning his own. The weight of the tasks pressed down on each of them. Mark stared at his letter, trying to hide his frustration, while Emily looked as if she were about to cry. Tom, on the other hand, felt a deep sense of dread creeping over him. This wasn't what they had expected. The promise of wealth had seemed like a solution to their problems, but now it felt like an impossible challenge. David watched their reactions closely, his heart heavy with both hope and apprehension. He knew his children had the potential to rise to the occasion, but whether they would was still uncertain. "This isn't a punishment," David said softly, breaking the silence. "It's a chance for you to grow. I know each of you is capable of more than you've allowed yourselves to become. These tasks are designed to help you discover that." As the chapter closes, David's children are left reeling from the unexpected challenge. Mark wonders if he can really step outside his comfort zone. Emily feels torn between her career and her relationships, and Tom is faced with the monumental task of rebuilding his life from the ground up. The question hangs in the air. Will they rise to the challenge, or will they fall back into their old ways? The weight of the tasks David had assigned lingered heavily on Mark, Emily, and Tom. Each of them left the family home that night feeling a mix of emotions: frustration, doubt, and, most of all, the overwhelming realization that their inheritance wouldn't come easily. Mark, used to making calculated business moves, found himself completely out of his depth as he searched for a struggling small business to help. He resented the task at first, seeing it as a waste of time. Why should he have to give away $100,000 and offer his hard-earned expertise for free? He had his own financial issues to deal with. After weeks of looking, Mark found a small family-owned bakery on the verge of closing. The owners were kind, hard-working people who had fallen behind due to a series of misfortunes. Mark hesitated. Helping them would mean stepping outside his comfort zone. Yet, as he observed their dedication and their struggle to keep the business alive, something within him shifted. He remembered how his father had once helped him start his own career, not with money, but with guidance. Slowly, Mark began offering advice and financial support, realizing that his father's task wasn't about charity. It was about empathy. Emily's task gnawed at her. Taking 3 months off from her career felt impossible. Her work had always been her identity, her security. Stepping away would mean risking her position, possibly even losing everything she had built. Nevertheless, Emily took a deep breath and handed in her temporary resignation. In the beginning, the time away felt like a void. She didn't know what to do without the constant pressure of deadlines and meetings. She awkwardly reconnected with old friends, many of whom had drifted away as she focused on her career. However, as the weeks passed, Emily began to appreciate the stillness. She rediscovered hobbies she had long abandoned and rekindled relationships that had grown distant. Her father's words echoed in her mind. True wealth comes from the connections you build, not the titles you hold. Emily started to see that perhaps her life had been missing something vital, meaningful relationships with people who truly cared about her, not just colleagues in the corporate world. Tom faced the most daunting task of all. Clearing his debts without relying on his father's money seemed insurmountable. He had lived recklessly for so long, jumping from job to job without any real purpose, and now he had to find stable work, something he had always struggled with. Determined to prove himself, Tom began working as a mechanic at a local garage, a far cry from the easy money schemes he had been involved in before. The work was hard, the hours long, and the pay modest. But for the first time in his life, Tom found pride in earning his own way. Each paycheck chipped away at his debt, and with each payment, he felt a growing sense of accomplishment. But more than the money, Tom began to understand the value of discipline and responsibility. His father's task wasn't just about paying off the debts, it was about teaching Tom the importance of standing on his own 2 feet. Months passed, and each sibling quietly worked through their tasks. Mark helped the bakery turn a profit, Emily found peace in her relationships, and Tom slowly rebuilt his life, one paycheck at a time. The siblings, once distant from each other, began to reconnect as well, sharing their experiences and reflecting on the wisdom of their father's tasks. Finally, David called them back together for another family meeting. This time, there was no tension or resentment. Instead, the atmosphere was filled with a quiet understanding. They had all changed, grown in ways they hadn't expected. As they gathered around the table, David smiled at them, seeing the transformation in each of his children. "I'm proud of all of you," he said, his voice full of emotion. "But there's one final thing left to do before we move forward with the inheritance." The siblings exchanged nervous glances. What more could their father ask of them? David leaned forward, his expression serious. "Now, you must work together." The task wasn't over yet. David's final request echoed in the air, leaving his children stunned. Work together. It was the one thing they hadn't done in years. Each sibling had lived their lives independently, disconnected from the family unit. Now, after months of personal growth and self-discovery, they were being asked to come together, to truly collaborate as a family. The next few weeks were difficult. Mark, Emily, and Tom had spent so long wrapped up in their individual lives that working together felt foreign and uncomfortable. But as they revisited the lessons their father had imparted on them, empathy, humility, and discipline. They began to find a rhythm. The challenges David had set for them had changed them in ways they couldn't have anticipated. They had grown not just as individuals, but as siblings, rediscovering a bond they thought was long gone. In the end, the siblings came together to establish a charitable foundation in their father's name. Using part of David's fortune, they created a legacy that would continue to help struggling families, just as Mark had helped the bakery and provide education opportunities for those in need. It was their way of honoring the values their father had instilled in them, values that money could never replace. As they stood together at the foundation's opening ceremony, David looked on from his wheelchair, his heart full. His children had learned the lessons he had hoped they would, not through wealth, but through the effort they had put into becoming better people. The wealth, as it turned out, was merely a tool for them to do good in the world. The real treasure was the strength of the family that had come back together. David's plan had succeeded beyond his expectations. His children had each faced their personal demons and come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more connected to each other. They had learned that money was not the true measure of wealth, but rather the relationships they built, the kindness they showed, and the responsibility they took for their actions. David passed away peacefully a few years later, content in knowing that his legacy was secure, not just through his fortune, but through the family he had rebuilt. His children, now leaders of a charitable foundation, continued to work together, ensuring that their father's lessons would live on for generations to come. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the importance of family, humility, and personal growth, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one.